Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Steve Knapp, President of the University, George Washington University here. Of course, I know many of you, but I know we also have some visitors from the community beyond the university. I'm very glad to see so many students as well as members of the faculty here. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to today's special presentation on the new global era of science and engineering. And I'm going to be introducing our very special guest in just a moment, but I do want to offer him a warm welcome. Dr. Suresh, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It's terrific to have you on our campus. I'm also pleased to acknowledge Dr. Dedrick Carter, Senior Advisor for Strategic Initiatives at the National Science Foundation. Thank you also for being here today. We're very proud of and pleased by, as so many of our fellow universities are, the partnership that we enjoy with the National Science Foundation, which of course is a tremendous force for good, I think, not only in this country, but really around the world. And I will say that it has many dimensions for our universities, it does for other universities, because the NSF is dedicated not only to innovation in science and technology, but also to the educational mission that supports the capacity of the nation to continue to be at the forefront of innovation. Our most recent award from NSF will support the development of high-tech kiosks that researchers can use to transfer large data sets to colleagues at other universities. So there's a problem of getting large data sets transferred. Sometimes they have to be sent through the mails because they're too massive for the networks. But this will actually be an opportunity where you can go up to a kiosk and insert a key into that kiosk and then send the set to colleagues, and that will greatly facilitate collaborative research across campuses and between universities. You know, when you reflect on those innovations and many others that are affecting science and technology these days, you become aware of a paradox, which is that we live in an era in which the promise of scientific and technological innovation to transform the human condition has never been greater than it is today. And yet we're also in an economic situation, to some extent a political situation, in which there are questions about the ability of our nation and other nations around the world to continue investing in science and technology at the levels that would really take these disciplines to as far as they can go, and we know that that potential is virtually unlimited in this 21st century. We're trying to do things on this campus that will promote the advance of science and technology. Some of those are pretty obvious for those of you who are visiting our campus today for the first time. You may have seen some of the cranes that are embellishing our skies here. And one of those, just 2 blocks from here, is involved in the construction of a 500,000 square foot science and engineering hall, which will be by far the largest scientific building, I'm pretty confident, ever constructed within 6 blocks of the White House. I think we can be pretty confident of that. And that's a building that's designed not only to house all of our engineering departments and a number of our basic scientists in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences, but also it will have 2 floors. The 2 top floors, when it's constructed, will simply be shelled out and left available for the growth of collaborative research projects that we're not even yet envisioning that will go into that building. So it's a very forward-looking project. And we're making similar advances on another large part of the university, which is our growing campus in Ashburn, Virginia, our science and technology campus, to which we just added 22 acres. This past summer, it's now a 123-acre campus. And we're about to break ground on a 5th facility there, and we have a tremendous potential to continue to grow that. And there we do a number of kinds of scientific and technological work that would be harder to do, in part because of their scale, in the heart of the District of Columbia. And in fact, our whole strategic plan, which we shared with the Faculty Assembly just a couple of days ago, and are about to present to the Board of Trustees after a year of preparation under the leadership of Provost Steve Lerman, who's right here in the front row. That strategic plan is focused, among other things, on innovation through interdisciplinary collaboration. And we're beginning to see the fruits of that collaboration in some of the new programs that we're bringing onto campus, and I'll just mention 2 of those briefly. One is our new Global Women's Institute, which we just launched this summer, and the new director of that, Dr. Mary Ellsberg, is here as the founding director. And another is our Computational Biology Institute, which we believe will have important implications for areas such as evolutionary biology and personalized medicine. And the founding director of that institute, Dr. Keith Crandall, is actually here in the audience. So just arrived this summer and is already getting that effort up and running. And we're exploring other areas where we think we can bring together disciplines that will make the whole greater than the sum of the parts, and really ranging across all of our schools. So these are projects that involve everything from medicine and public health to the law school to the Graduate School of Education and Human Development, the work we do in public policy, many departments in the Columbia College of Arts and Sciences, our School of Nursing, and certainly our School of Engineering and Applied Science. And these include efforts in the area of autism and neurodevelopment disorders. And I think we're going to see more of these kinds of strategic partnerships across the university developing. But there's no question that our partnerships with the National Science Foundation, which we enjoy along with so many of our fellow universities, are a big part of bringing that, all of those aspirations to reality. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the person who is leading, I think, an extraordinarily innovative period at the NSF, Dr. Subra Suresh, who brings to our campus this afternoon a remarkably rich background as a scientist, an engineer, and an administrator. After his nomination by President Obama, he was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2010 as the director of the National Science Foundation, now a $7 billion, I think current budget proposal, $7.4 billion federal agency charged with advancing research and education across all the fields of fundamental science and engineering. Before taking on his current role, Dr. Suresh served as the Dean of the School of Engineering and the Vannevar Bush Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is himself an interdisciplinary scientist, well known for his experimental and modeling work on the mechanical properties of structural and functional materials, his innovative work on materials design and characterization, and on possible connections between cellular nanomechanical processes and human disease states. And we had, by the way, a fascinating conversation about that at lunch, about some of the innovations he's been involved in that area. These have sparked, I think, a great deal of activity in a number of different fields of intellectual endeavor. As the director of NSF, Dr. Suresh has a unique vision of the role that science can play in advancing human progress. He's used his extraordinary insights to direct NSF initiatives in fields ranging from astronomy to nanotechnology. He's also a keen thinker on the evolution of research tools and technology and the role of citizens as partners in advancing scientific discovery. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Subra Suresh.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, President Knapp, for your kind introduction. Provost Lerman and the colleagues and friends, and I'm glad to see many students here. NSF does basic research, and our mission is to do basic research in science and engineering in all fields of science. And as President Knapp mentioned, we support research with taxpayer money to the tune of $7.4 billion a year, US taxpayer money. So the question is, why should the US taxpayer pay their money to the National Science Foundation so that we can give the money to universities that do the innovation? So let me start with a story that goes back a little while ago. This is in England, and you all have heard of Michael Faraday, who first produced electricity in his lab. When Faraday one day met the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is the Treasury Secretary of the UK, William Gladstone, Mr. Gladstone asked him, why should the British taxpayer pay for your curiosity, and what is the value of electricity? To which Mr. Faraday apparently responded, sir, one day you're going to tax it. Okay? And tax they did. So that's exactly the response I give. In fact, this year it came up in my congressional testimony earlier this year. How can you ask for $7.4 billion when so many Americans are unemployed? We have huge national debt, budget deficit. My response was, if you take the income to the US Treasury from the work that the National Science Foundation supports every year, it'll be many, 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 many times $7.4 billion. And that's why you need to support basic research. I'll give you many, many more justifications during the course of this talk. I could talk about a lot of different things about science and engineering research, research funding, global competition, education in STEM fields. NSF does research into STEM education. I thought I'll focus in the time that I have, focus my attention for about 30 to 40 minutes or so on what I call the new era of global science and engineering, the major challenges that it's bringing to institutions and global institutions such as George Washington University, but also the tremendous opportunities they provide as we look to the future. And the challenges that face the universities are very much part and parcel of the challenges that National Science Foundation faces. So first of all, why new era? What is so new about it? And why do we call it a new era? There are many, many reasons for it. I'm just going to focus on perhaps 3 or 4 key trends of this new era. First, we have a lot of global challenges that are perhaps increasing in frequency as the population of the planet significantly increases and migrates to major cities. So from pandemics, natural and man-made disasters, et cetera, et cetera. So even if you take things like infectious disease, when SARS started in 2003, China and then Hong Kong and then Singapore, and then the scare about SARS spread around the world, I was actually taking a flight that day from Singapore to Boston. So I was quarantined by my wife, who was in charge of public health department for the local town, to make sure that I did not bring a disease from some other part of the country. But the point there is this. Something like an infectious disease can start anywhere in the world, and it's only one airline flight away to get anywhere else in the world. That's globalization for pandemics. And so that's the modern world we live in. And when you have such a large population, how do you contain it? How do you address it? Disasters from Fukushima to the nuclear disaster last year, displaced populations, water shortages, food security, all kinds of issues. So these are global challenges, but they don't stop at the border. Just like SARS didn't stop in one place. It can get there through airline travel, commercial airline travel. So these are global challenges. We can have policies and practices as a national agency, federal agency, or as a country, but these problems don't stop at the borders, and we really need international engagement. How does a federal agency, a national agency, whose mission is to support national enterprise, continue to operate through its mission, but be a global leader? So that's a challenge for us. So we have a borderless knowledge enterprise. So anybody, any child in any part of the world with an access to a computer and an internet or a mobile device can be part of the knowledge enterprise. And not only that, the talent can be recruited from anywhere in the world to work face-to-face or through virtual means. And that's happening increasingly. And that's, if anything, that's going to accelerate significantly. So no boundaries exist even for that. Shifting demographics, and I'll show a little bit more data. There are more scientists and engineers already, and it'll increase significantly in the foreseeable future, concentrated in Asia because of the population. And what are the implications of that for the future of science and engineering? And we need to grasp that as a funding agency. Shifting economics. So countries large and small, from Qatar, a very, very small country, both in terms of land size and population, to Singapore, to India and China, as very large countries with large populations, are seeing, their governments are seeing, that science and engineering investments in science and engineering is a means to economic prosperity. So not necessarily for publications or patents for intellectual curiosity, but as a necessary step to move up the economic ladder where hundreds of millions of people can leave poverty and have improved quality of life. And as that is happening with education and with research, how do we engage in this globalized world? We compete very vigorously, we'll continue to compete in the coming years, but also we need to cooperate and collaborate. And then as a funding agency, we have other responsibilities as well. And I'll come to that later in more detail. But the point is this: many countries, including many of the countries that I mentioned, look up to the US. With all the problems that we have internally, they still view us as an intellectual leader. And what leadership role do we play in making sure that the science and engineering enterprise, as it thrives with or without us all over the world, thrives in the right way so that humanity moves forward in the right way? Can they learn from our success stories? Can they learn from our mistakes? And what kind of leadership role do we exercise in this global process while serving national needs, while staying within our mandate, a national mandate as a national funding agency? So let me put some numbers in perspective. So this is investments in research R&D and in human capital normalized by either the GDP of a country or by the population of a country. So on the horizontal axis, you have R&D investments as a function of GDP. On the vertical axis, you have the number of scientists and engineers in the country per million population. So both are normalized numbers. There are three main colors. There are four colors. It's all color coded. So even if you cannot read the individual letters, all the green colors are the Americas. So United States, Canada, and Mexico are there. All the other countries in the Americas, North and South America, have too small an investment to appear on this scale. That's why you see only three. And the size of the circle is an indicator of the size of investment in research, in R&D. So all the greens are the Americas, and the US is the biggest in the world right now. All the blue ones are Asia. So if you look at the blue ones to your right, you have South Korea at the top, right above Japan. Australia, as being lumped into Asia, is in the middle. And you have China and India in the lower left, but China and India are moving up very, very rapidly in this scale. And you can see that China's circle is becoming almost as big as Japan's circle in R&D. Then all the orange circles are Europe. So if you sum up all the areas of all the circles, you get a very simple picture. 1/3 of all the R&D investment is in the US, in the world, for the world. 1/3 is in the European Union, and 1/3 is in Asia. And the Asian part is increasing very rapidly. So of course, in this curve, in this plot, you want to be in the top right. The country that's closest to the top right is Finland. And then you have Sweden, you have Singapore way up there. You have South Korea, Japan, Denmark. Then just below the US, you have Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. The country farthest to the right is Israel. So on this plot, Israel has an investment in R&D, which is more than 4% of Israel's GDP. But it's a small population, and they are not vertically up there, but horizontally they are very far to the right. So this is one point I want to make. The second point I would like to make is that the National Science Board indicators, which were released just a few months ago, showed that for the first time in the history of science funding, the top 10 Asian countries collectively invested as much in R&D last year as the United States did last year. That has never happened before. And their investment rate is increasing. So that's the second trend that we want to pay attention to. Russia is in the middle in red, and still they have a long way to go in this graph. Now let's look at scholarly publications. There are two time windows over which this is shown. So on the left, smaller donut, you have 1999 to 2003. The red segment is the United States. The beige segment in the left figure is Japan. Below that was UK, and China was way behind, around 3% or 4%. India was not even on that plot. Just 5 years later, on this figure, from 2004 to 2008, the fraction of scholarly publications all over the world for the US dropped from 26 to 21%. China moved up from number 6 or 7 to number 2 at 10%. UK remained at 7%, number 3, and Japan dropped to number 4. Okay? And all the others, which is the big yellow on the left, from about 8 o'clock to 12 o'clock, that increased from 30 to 34%. So countries like Singapore, small countries, Finland, et cetera, collectively are investing much more. So this is the second major trend with respect to publications. So this is the output, one output. The previous slide is the input, including capital development. Now let's look at another kind of input for undergraduate students, especially college graduates. So what this plot shows is the percent of college graduates who get a degree either in natural sciences or in engineering in 3 major parts of the world. So on your right is Asia. So 20% of all the college graduates in Asia get their undergraduate degree in engineering. About 14% in natural sciences. In Europe, both are about 12%. In the US, about 11% in natural sciences. In the most recent data, 4.4% of all college graduates in the US are engineering graduates across the country. And only 1.43% of all the college graduates in the US are women engineers, half the population. So that's one really sobering thought. But then there is something inconsistent between this data, which is true. It was just published this year by the National Science Board after a lot of research, and the following statement. By anybody's measure, the United States, at least for the last half century, has been the undisputed innovation leader. Nobody would argue with that in science, engineering, and technology. Nobody would argue with that. That's true. And this trend, 4.4% of all college graduates being engineers, is nothing new. We've been declining steadily over decades. It used to be 7%, a little more than a decade ago. If we were relatively that bad, how did we remain innovation leaders for several decades? Think of Google, Apple, all kinds of things. The innovations came from the US, from the 50 states of the US, even though manufacturing may be abroad. How did we remain leaders? There are many answers to this, but I can give a few answers. It's only a personal perspective. Number one, no matter where the talent comes from, the United States has been an undisputed magnet for talent from all over the world. So you take the number of American Nobel laureates in the last 50 years, more than a third of them got their first degree abroad. Dr. Steve Lerman and I were on the faculty at MIT before he came here, and I went to NSF. And when I was Dean of Engineering, in the School of Engineering at MIT, at least 2 years ago, according to the data, there are 375 professors in engineering. 43% of them were born abroad, myself included. So look at the economic benefit to the US for being a magnet for talent from all over the world. So by some measures, it costs about $500,000 to raise a child from birth through undergraduate education. $500,000 per child through age 22, right? So if you look at the economic, so some other taxpayer in some other country is paying to invest in science and engineering, that becomes part and parcel of the American scientific enterprise. So that's one factor. The second factor is the wisdom in the US, going back to the Sputnik era and before, of not only having sustained investments in science and engineering, but nurturing ideals, principles, and institutions that ensure those ideals and principles, that make sure that we have an open and transparent process, and institutions to ensure research integrity, ethics, respect for and protection of intellectual property, et cetera, and freedom, personal freedom. So I would argue that it's not just the dollars invested in science and engineering, it's the values placed on those attributes and the institutions that are created to ensure them, whether it's the National Institutes of Health, or Department of Energy of Basic Science, or Department of Defense, or the National Science Foundation. These institutions have refined and developed at least over the last 60 years, these values that are part and parcel of the science and engineering enterprise. And that's exactly where our leadership role comes for the global scientific enterprise. And how do we play a role? So I'll talk a little bit about what we are trying to do in that regard. Let me give you one more sobering data point. So last year, if you take all the college freshmen in all the universities in the US, in all 50 states, add to that all the college freshmen in all the universities in all the 27 countries of the European Union, and add to that all the college freshmen in all of Japan, that sum total equaled the number of college freshmen just in China. So that's the absolute number, and this is the relative number. So that goes back to my point about where the concentration of scientific talent is. Then there is another argument that people usually make, and that is we produce the highest quality students and papers and scholarly publications and patents. My response to that is, did Toyota produce good cars in the 1960s? Did Lexus exist? Does Lexus produce good cars? Did Samsung was Samsung a major player in the global TV manufacturing business and mobile phones? So we cannot underestimate the competition, the power of the competition, especially when the people are very eager to innovate, and there is plenty of talent all over the world, and we need to keep that in mind. Now let me talk about the intellectual drivers of this why is this a new era of science and engineering, and why we know it's global. Hopefully I convinced you why it's global, but why is it a new era, and what are the intellectual drivers behind science and engineering as we see it at this point in time? Again, there are many, many unique excitements about science, and I can articulate at least two of them that cut through every field of science and engineering, including medicine, public health, et cetera, et cetera. So we have at this point in time capabilities. These are experimental capabilities through instrumentation and infrastructure, computational capabilities through modeling and simulation, data capabilities through computer hardware and software and portable devices, and capabilities that can probe the tiniest of objects or the farthest of distances. So what does it mean for NSF-funded research? So just 4 weeks ago, the NSF-funded telescope in the South Pole, geographic South Pole in Antarctica, discovered a new set of in cosmology, discovered a whole new system that people did not know it existed before. And this is right at the cutting edge of science. So last year, the 2 Nobel Prizes in physics, where the work was done using NSF-funded facility in Chile, using NSF-funded grant in the US by 2 American scientists, they received the Nobel Prize for astrophysics. And that work was done there. So you cannot put an economic value for this. This is at the cutting edge, right at the forefront of astrophysics. Just 3 months ago, or just a year ago, we drilled about 3 kilometers deep into Antarctic ice to understand carbon capture over millennia and the implications of that for the age of the universe, to pollution, to climate change, to penguin population, to fish that produce crystals in their stomach, to all kinds of things. So that's one extreme of large distances, billions of light years away. At the other extreme, we fund research that looks at, that can take a single DNA molecule and manipulate forces of the order of a piconewton. So pico is 1 in 1 trillion, 10 to the minus 12. A piconewton, a displacement of an angstrom, an atomic distance, with a time step of a femtosecond, which is orders of magnitude smaller than pico. We can do that on a desktop instrument. A smart student can actually build something like this in a matter of a few weeks for a few $1,000s, and many students have done that. And that's the kind of technology span that we have. This is the new era of observation and simulation. So the new era of observation and simulation has also produced And the next new era that we live in, which is a new era of data and information. So your Apple iPad generates about a terabyte of data per day. So we just approved a new telescope jointly between NSF and the US Department of Energy. When it comes into full operation around 2018, it'll produce approximately, it'll scan the sky, the entire sky with unprecedented resolution every 2 weeks. It'll produce 10 terabytes of data per day. So this massive amount of data, coupled with the data that we have from the Human Genome Projects, bioinformatics, and all kinds of other fields, the information travels at the speed of light, unvetted, unpeer-reviewed, and blogs become facts. And once it's out there, you cannot undo it. And how do you make sure that we fund the science now so that many years from now, we can separate knowledge from mountains of data, extract useful knowledge out of it, and curate it and archive it in perpetuity across rapidly changing platforms? And we don't know what they are yet. And who will pay for it? And it's international. Should the National Science Foundation pay so that somebody else half a world away can have free access for it? Why should the US taxpayer pay for it? Even if we choose to pay for it, what control do we have on how that information is used? Privacy, confidentiality, cybersecurity, intellectual property, national security, export control. And what are the laws? What are the policies? And even if we have policies, who will develop them? And who will enforce them? And who will police them? It's an open question. And that's why it's a new era of very uncharted territory. So let me give you a few examples of this new era. So science and engineering in the Arctic. So this is the highest point in the Arctic Circle in Greenland. You see the red star in the middle. And the NSF has a station there. So every year, hundreds of graduate students and faculty members from many universities go there, of course, in the summer in the Arctic. And I went there last summer. And this is the highest point in the Arctic at 10,500 feet. So we have a station there. There are 15 countries involved in this. And this is a picture I took from the cockpit of a C-130 Air Force plane from about 30,000 feet altitude. And there are many, many types of research that's being done in pretty much every field of science and engineering. And the pilots, I was sitting behind the pilots, and they were telling me that this is the Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland, in the northwest corner of Greenland, somewhere here. And this is the glacier. You can see the glacier here. 10 years ago, it used to be here. Just in 10 years, it has receded here. Okay? And this year, we have had the lowest amount of ice in the Arctic in recorded history. So the question is, these are big scientific questions involving many institutions, many countries. Denmark and the National Science Foundation play a key role in maintaining this facility. Going forward, as many other countries join in, who will pay for it? How do we understand the globe and any changes to the globe from a scientific perspective so that without any bias, we can look at real data and try to interpret it the right way? So that's another big question with respect to facilities. Here is another facility. It's currently being built in Marionette, Wisconsin. So this is a ship that will be owned by NSF. And it's going to be launched next week, Friday of next week from tomorrow, and I'll be there. And this is a ship. This ship will leave Wisconsin soon. It's going to come to Washington, D.C. next year. And then from here, it's going to go through Panama to the Arctic, through Alaska. And University of Alaska is involved in this. And this is going to do research, and thousands of students and faculty members for the next 40 years will be doing research on this ship as the ship travels through Alaska. And the ship is owned by NSF, but the experiments are all done by universities. And this infrastructure will have a huge impact on scientific research in many fields, many different fields, and big data is a part and parcel of this. Let's go from the Arctic to the Antarctic. This is the NSF facility in the South Pole. And that's the plane on skis. That's the C-130, the plane that I was telling you about. And these are the facilities in the Antarctic. And there are 31 countries involved. And these 31 countries jointly signed the US Antarctic Treaty. And this involves research in every field of science and engineering, from neutrino physics to penguin studies to the artists in residence in the Antarctic, to big data, to cosmology, and you name it. Every field is involved in this. So the NSF leads for all the other agencies. NASA has a facility where they do high-altitude balloon experiments, which we coordinate. NOAA does experiments on atmospheric research. Satellite communications in the Antarctic, ozone layer formation. These are all part and parcel of research. Also, this involves science diplomacy. So when diplomacy doesn't move forward as fast as we would like through state departments in different countries, NSF often gets engaged. I never knew that this was in my job description when I started, but there is a lot of interesting things that go on with respect to diplomacy with the 31 countries, and dealing with embassies in Washington has been a very interesting part of this job description. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a discovery here that it was found that one of the NSF-funded studies found that the emperor penguin population, happily, is twice what it was thought before. And that's a very good news. And that's through some research that was done. And so that's not in physics or big data, but that's an important piece of information. Talking of real-time networks, so the probe that you see there, it's a float, and you can see that in relation to the size of the man standing there. Every time a commercial ship or a special ship that we commission goes through any ocean in the world, this probe is dropped in the ocean. In real time, it beams. It has an antenna, satellite antenna. It beams data on the salinity or the acidity of the ocean, the temperature, etc. So you can continuously monitor. So entities like Scripps Oceanographic Institute in California or Woods Hole Institute in Massachusetts, they receive this data. So scientists in real time can monitor the health of the oceans. And this is another example of real-time big data. We have another facility called IRIS, where the S stands for seismology. There are 80 countries and 140 institutions involved in this, so that if there is an earthquake in Japan, even the shocks that precede the earthquake are detected by scientists in many different parts of the US. So that you can, and as technology gets better, are the things that we can do to address the risk involved in all of this. So this is each dot here, this is time frame starting from 2001 until now. Every time a ship goes through some part of the ocean, it drops this float, this little float. And each dot is a float. So you can see from, as the time clock ticks on your lower left, that's the number of floats from 2003. So NOAA is a big player in this area. And so as of 3 months ago, we had 5,300 floats or so around the all across the oceans around the planet, and there are 50 active NSF awards that used to study this in real time. Students and scientists work on this. So this is another example of infrastructure and big data. So in other facilities, this is a plane. This is not our corporate jet. This is a plane owned by NSF, but it's in Boulder, Colorado. So this actually, you'll see some students sitting in the plane. This is a Gulfstream 5 that flies through the atmosphere gathering data, and many graduate students do their PhD thesis on this plane, experimental work. So that's another facility that we have. We just commissioned with DOE a facility called LSST, Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. It'll be based in Chile, and it'll come into operation in 2018. It'll have the biggest mapping of the sky ever. ALMA is another facility. It stands for Atacama Large Millimeter Array Telescope, again based in Chile. On the 15th of October, end of next week, I'll go from Wisconsin to Wyoming to open this center. It's the National Center for Atmospheric Research Wyoming Supercomputer Center. It's a $50 million facility. It has the best capability at petaflop level for atmospheric research. It's run by NCAR, which is the largest NSF-funded center, but the supercomputing facility will be based in Wyoming. And the state of Wyoming is the first NSF facility in the state of Wyoming, and the state of Wyoming put up the building at their cost. So let me focus on what are the barriers to science and engineering, and how do we address those barriers. There are many. Funding is governed by national and local policies and processes and priorities that impede collaboration on a global scale. We want to compete, but if we put the walls down, when science is global and borderless, how do we collaborate? If there are, as national agencies with a national mandate, of course we have to follow national laws. How do we collaborate? It makes it really difficult for us because we are the only Western country that does less than annual budgeting, planning. All the other countries do multi-year planning. So how do we engage in a multi-year planning process for a facility for 2020 when we don't know what the 2013 budget is for the fiscal year that started last Monday? So that's where we are. We have lack of uniformity and consistency in scientific peer review. So how do you make decisions about science funding, science publications that are free of political influence in any country? And unfortunately, as funding decisions are made all over the world, you want to make sure that scientific decisions are made the right way by peers. And it's not a perfect system, but how do we make sure the system evolves in that way? And there is significant lack of uniformity around the globe, and especially as countries invest significant new resources into it, how do we harmonize it in a coherent way? Who's going to assure quality, access, ownership, and long-term preservation of information and data, including publications? And what are the common policies, including intellectual property rights, public access, and mobility of researchers, freedom of mobility of researchers? That's a huge thing in many countries. Then I'm going to pose a few questions. I don't know the answers, but these are questions that we need to address in this new era. Who will develop policies and ensure compliance? State Department doesn't decide on policies on a global scale, even though they can bring people together. NSF doesn't do it. Can one government do it and expect everybody else to follow? At what stage do you bring them in? How do you get everybody to come to the table and agree to something that we are very comfortable with, that we have developed for the last 60 years, and they are newcomers to the game, and we can't tell them what to do, because this is our way of doing business. How do you engage them in this enterprise? Who will organize, integrate, and distribute in big data that I just showed you? Who will create policies? Who will develop guidelines? Just during lunch, we were talking about as massively online open courses become available across national borders for education. Who's going to make sure that the appropriate economic model, policies, et cetera, are in place on a global scale? Not just across universities, but across agencies that fund this enterprise. And how will institutions and individuals participate in this while addressing national needs? So I'm going to finish with a few thoughts on what NSF is trying to do in this regard, and we will try to wrap up at that point. How do we embrace global solutions as a national agency operating within the borders of the US? So before that, I want to say just one slide on NSF, what NSF does. And many of you know this, and for those who may not know. So our annual budget is a little north of $7 billion. And all the money we receive, minus an overhead of about 5.7%, goes back to the community. So we operate a $7 billion agency on less than 6% overhead, while handling tens of thousands of proposals and supporting hundreds of thousands of scientists in every state of the country, in pretty much every institution in the country. So that's the first point. We fund basic research across all science and engineering disciplines, including social, behavioral, and economic sciences, and we focus on research into STEM education. So we're not in charge of monitoring education, because that's the Department of Education's domain, and it's local and state, not federal. But we are engaged in research into best practices. Last year, we supported 300,000 individuals in the country in more than 2,000 institutions. We have to walk a very fine line between individual scholarship, because individuals, a young person, can have a brilliant idea that can change the world 20 years from now. We want to make sure that we support them. So one of the decisions I made during this tough economic climate is no matter what happens to NSF budget, we will not cut back on our support for graduate students, postdocs, or young faculty members. On grounds of principles, we'll protect it. And we'll continue to do that. We doubled the number of graduate research fellowships 2 years ago. And we've kept it at that level no matter what the budget will be. So the balance between individual scholarship and big facilities, the reason is, we talk about the Sputnik moment that galvanized a country. Many people went into science because of President Kennedy's famous speech on putting man on the moon and bringing him back safely. But there are a lot of other things as well. That's important. That's very important. We put man on the moon before we put wheels on the suitcase. And wheels on the suitcase are very useful too. And that's an innovation too. We want to make sure that all the innovations happen, both very big innovations and very small innovations, and we need to support that. And we want to fund the best people and the best ideas. Unfortunately, the demand for the resources is far in excess of the resources that we have to support them. Here is another interesting point. Since 1951, so NSF was established in 1950. Since 1951, NSF has supported 197 American Nobel laureates. That's 70% of all the American Nobel laureates since 1951 have been funded by the National Science Foundation. So think about it this way. NSF identifies Nobel Prize winning work decades before the Nobel Prize Selection Committee identifies them. NSF identifies on the basis of potential, whereas the Prize Committee identifies them on the basis of accomplished record. Potential is more difficult to identify. Secondly, more importantly, on average, NSF has given them more money than the Nobel Prize Committee has given them. And so another point, since 1952, we have funded 46,500 NSF graduate research fellows, 46,500. Many more in recent years. Out of the 46,500 NSF fellows, 38 have won the Nobel Prize since 1951. 38. And that's mostly in the last 30 years. Right? That's a huge success rate. So as imperfect as NSF is in its identification of funding and people, this is the track record that we have. So let me move on to a few quick topics before I conclude. Tackling national and global challenges. So science, engineering, and education for sustainability is a $200 million project. So in addition to funding individuals and infrastructure, we want to fund things that are individual projects but that are aligned with national goals and major international grand challenges. Sustainability is one of them. Cyber infrastructure framework for the 21st century. That's a $120 million effort across pretty much every discipline within NSF. National Robotics Initiative, from the Gulf oil spill 2 years ago to robotic surgery. We are the largest contributor to the National Robotics Initiative that the President announced about a year or so ago at Carnegie Mellon. National Nanotechnology Initiative was funded by NSF. Biomaps, the intersection of biology with mathematical and physical sciences and engineering. Advanced manufacturing, we fund upstream research, whereas NIST and others fund more downstream research. Trustworthy computing, cybersecurity, and risk assessment is another area. Materials Genome Project, so that we can cut down the time from design of a new material to its implementation in practice by more than half. Computational science and engineering and big data, I already mentioned. I also mentioned about real-time networks and major research facilities. So how are we going to address these challenges and questions that I posed before? So in May of this year, with invitation from the White House and with in close consultation with the State Department, we hosted an event at NSF where we invited one science and engineering funding agency head, my counterpart, from each of 46 plus 2 countries. 46 represent G20 plus OECD countries, plus 2. So we invited 48 people from 48 countries. 47 of them came at their own expense. So sitting around the table, that group collectively represented 95% of science and engineering funding in the world. So we wanted to pose these questions to that group and ask them, how are we going to solve them? These are the questions. Let's figure out collectively how we are going to solve them. Because somebody has to ultimately pay for all of this, and no one country has to pay for this. We all have our own national limits. So this group came together, and Science Magazine, I wrote an editorial the following week for Science, and they asked me for a one sentence to start with, and I thought this will be a good sentence. Good science anywhere is good for science everywhere. And good science includes openness, transparency, ethics, integrity, respect for intellectual property, etc. This is the group that assembled at NSF in May of this year. The next meeting will be held in Berlin, jointly hosted by Brazil and Germany in this building in the center of Berlin. And there are 2 agenda items for this, and these go back to some of the questions that I posed. At this meeting, they will release research integrity document, collectively developed, collectively endorsed, and they will also start the multi-year process of discussing not only the mechanism, but also the economics of open access to publications and data. And the work has already begun through regional meetings to be held all over the world. The next meeting starts in Mexico, followed by Brussels, then Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and then Sendai in Japan. And they will all report out before this meeting, and this meeting will release the document. There are a few things we can do without new money. So our mission is to fund only American scientists. We don't send money abroad. USAID funds only developing countries with US taxpayer money. Until last year, our 2 agencies were working unbeknownst to each other. So American scientists could not, in a coordinated way, collaborate with developing countries and vice versa. So Dr. Rajiv Shah, who's the head of USAID, and our organization, my colleagues, we got together and we announced a new program called PEER in July of last year. And with this program now, we can coordinate the funding between developing countries and American universities. For example, we had a project that was coordinated between Columbia University and Bangladesh. And we have projects from other universities in the US and sub-Saharan Africa. And these programs, so last year we had 6 projects, this year we have 42. And they have several $100 million. It doesn't cost NSF an extra penny. And the impact of this is potentially enormous. So we have a number of requests from other countries wanting to partner with NSF with their own resources to work with developing countries. There are 2 aspects with respect to disasters that we see around the world, human tragedies. Integration of social, behavioral, and economic sciences is very critical. We are the only federal agency that supports all fields of science and engineering, including this SPE field. We believe that it's extremely critical, and this is a very controversial topic, but we feel that natural sciences and engineering will not have the full impact if we don't have social, behavioral, and economic sciences coupled to that enterprise. The other one, I personally believe that the diversity of geographical, cultural, ethnic, and social perspectives coming into science from around the world will fundamentally enrich the quality of science. And that's very important. That's why these global initiatives, I believe, are extremely important. We launched a program for interdisciplinary research this year to the tune of $30.6 million with 40 awards. And the idea is this. If a young person, even an individual, has a revolutionary idea which may be high risk, it usually falls between traditional disciplinary silos. How can we avoid it? And how can we make sure this is nurtured? There are a lot of impediments in current structures of universities and at NSF. And how do we make sure this happens? So at steady state, this will be a $120 million program. So we have carrots and nudges. And before NSF can do successfully, internally we have to make sure that we operate as an agency the right way so that interdisciplinary research can be fostered. This is the outcome of the 40 awards. So with this award, each of the link is between different offices at NSF. So for the first time, we have so many funding possibilities across offices which did not exist before. So if we can do it inside NSF, we cannot expect universities to do it. So we have to start with in-house. I want to say just a couple of things about innovation. Our goal is to fund basic research, and we will not deviate from that. But having said that, there are a lot of innovations that come out of basic research that may not see the light of day because there are so many institutions in the country, thousands of institutions that don't have the ecosystem of innovation. They don't even have a technology licensing officer. They don't have the infrastructure. So a young person, a graduate student or a faculty member may not know who to go to, and they don't have access to VCs. So NSF can help without necessarily taking money away from basic research. So historically, we have done that through the SBIR program. We were the first federal agency to start it, the Small Business Innovation Research. We have engineering research centers, science and technology centers, et cetera. Last year, we launched a program called the NSF Innovation Corps, which we believe is at the so-called ditch of death, before the valley of death. So what does it mean? It means that you do research. At the end of research, you have brilliant scientific discoveries. But if you had a little bit of money and a short period of time after your research, can you explore whether it has any value beyond just a publication or a patent? But who will pay for it? Currently, universities pay for it. Can NSF help? So through a public-private partnership, we launched this last year. In the first year, we had 100 programs. One of our projects we funded for only $50,000 last week was acquired by Dropbox. Another project was featured in Science in dissolvable electronics in the human body. These are $50,000 grants. It also changes the culture inside NSF. We make the decision in 4 weeks, from the time of submission of a proposal to the time of notification, 4 times a year. So this is what happens with this. Now let me show you an impact of these kinds of activities at NSF on American jobs and American economy.
And fortunately, the National Science Foundation came along at just the right time and offered a grant for small business.
Qualcomm was very small when it received its first SBIR grants, I think in the order of 15 people or so. That helped us continue ahead, grow, develop some technology.
Well, it meant the difference between starting and not starting. It meant everything in those early days. And now, today, it employs over 18,000 people.
We now employ something over 21,000 people.
It all started with that little $25,000 grant.
And so these things have very large multiplier factors to them.
What really causes economic growth is it's always innovation. So how do we get more of it? We invest in basic research. That's as simple as that.
So my last 2 slides before a recommendation. So we launched another activity last October, almost a year ago tomorrow, called SAVI, Science Across Virtual Institutes, a way to leverage what we already fund with new investments abroad so that American scientists can benefit from new investments abroad. So we started with mathematics. We put in $6 million. Partners in Asia put in $20 million a year. Our investment is $6 million. We put in $2 million for wireless communication. Finland put in $2 million for wireless communication. We put our graduate student awards. The European Commission just signed an agreement for young professors, hundreds of young professors, to go to Europe with their support to match ours. So this is leveraging on a global scale. So this is what SAVI does. So we launched it a year ago. As of now, we have 12 of this. We are now negotiating a new one with Asia, a fairly large-scale program to benefit our graduate students. So this is another global opportunity. And the last but not least, one of the biggest sources of attrition of talented, highly educated scientists in the US, especially women scientists, is the significant demands to balance career with the family demands. And it affects both men and women, but it affects women disproportionately significantly. So how do we address this? So last year in September, we held the first ever NSF event at the White House, and the First Lady came and launched this for us. And our goal is to work with the American Association of American Universities and Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities to come up with ways NSF can provide policy changes and funding in partnership with universities to develop models so that we can change this, and we have a 10-year horizon to address this on a national scale. It's not just up to NSF, but we are happy to take a lead. We are now partnering with NIH and NASA to move this along because it's a major issue for the country. Let me close with the following at least 5 recommendations. There are many recommendations, things that we need to do. How do we harmonize global science and engineering? Standardize principles for merit review and research integrity. Share resources to increase the scope and global impact of scientific experimentation. New options to share the research output of major scientific instrumentation and infrastructure. How do we develop new ways and policies to guide and collect data and information, and how do we share it and distribute it around the globe, including developing economic models? And last but not least, enhancing transport and mobility of scientists, especially young people, so that we have brain circulation that benefits everybody while staying within national boundaries. So this is sort of our goal for the future. Thank you very much.
I'm Jeff Sitch from the medical school. You talked about coming up with systems that allow cooperation. And I know the EU has been doing a lot in cooperative science, funding grants outside of the normal restrictions of national boundaries. You know, is there any feedback from that process? You know, given the amount of, how should I say, antagonism within the EU today over economic matters, you know, have they been able to overcome those on the scientific playing field?
Yeah. So they have a number of recent policies that enable them to do that. For example, first they started within EU. So the funding doesn't go to the institution, it goes to the individual. So if an individual in any one of the 27 EU countries moves from one country to another, they can take their project with them. So they started with that. Now they are starting to think about allowing some projects abroad. So actually funding. Now NSF doesn't fund foreign researchers because our demand domestically far surpasses our ability to support scientists domestically. But there are other agencies in the US that do that. USAID is one of them. ONR actually supports research abroad. And there are other US agencies that do this. You know, I don't foresee the possibility in the near future of our being able to, NSF being able to support research abroad, but we support facilities abroad. And we also support overseas scientists who may come and work at American universities. Through the grants through American universities, they can benefit from them. So we do it indirectly, but not directly.
Hello, Charles Garris from the School of Engineering. I was looking at some data on NSF funding recently, and I may be wrong, and you can correct me, but in 2002, the budget for NSF was something like $6 billion.
No.
No?
So in the last 11 years, our budget has doubled, roughly.
Is that correct?
So our budget now is $7.some billion, 7.1 for 7.03 actually for 2012, which is the enacted level. So we're increased by about 85 to 90%, nearly doubled. So whatever you can do the math, and so many years ago it was less than that.
Oh well, that's very good news.
In 2006, before 2008, before the stimulus funding, it was 5 million something. So the stimulus funding added abruptly about $1 billion to NSF budget, and so that money is now gone. So we are down from because that was a one-time boost, and that's gone. But if you eliminate that one-time boost, but if you look at the last 10 years, there's been a steady increase. We've nearly doubled over an 11-year period or so.
But nevertheless, you know, I have served on several NSF panels, and I was a program director at NSF at a long time ago, in 1989, or around then. And one thing I noticed is that over the years, the average grant size seems to be roughly the same. You know, in other words, in 1989, the average grant size was a 3-year grant for $300,000, and it still seems to be that way.
Now the average grant for 3 years is about $500,000. So it hasn't. You are right. It hasn't increased that much. Perhaps it has not kept with the cost of research, but it has increased very slightly, but not enough.
So I guess my final question then is, well, how do you see the budget trends changing in this economy for NSF? I mean, obviously your presentation is a very excellent one to show the value of NSF to the United States and to our future, but how well is it being received?
So I think data speaks louder than words. So here are so in the last, so if you take 2003, so NIH, for example, had a significant boost to funding in the 1990s. Their budgets more than tripled over that time frame when NSF was increasing 1%, 2%, few percent points in the 90s. In the last 10 years, the budget has doubled, so it's about a 5%, 5.5% annual average growth in the last 10 to 12 years or so. We are definitely off the doubling path that we thought we were on by the time of 2016. I'm still being told that the budget will double even, but we don't know over what time frame. So it'll eventually double. But here is the point to your question. I think if you look at last year, we probably got the highest increase of any federal agency in terms of dollar increase. In 2012, which is the most recent year for which we have data, we had a 2.5% increase when other budgets for other agencies were flat. We realize, I think part of the reason for that, and it's completely bipartisan, the reason for that is the bipartisan support and perhaps realization that not only do we need to fund science at tough economic times, it's especially during tough economic times that we need to fund science. And I continue to talk about the point that the Morrill Act was created that led to the land-grant universities in 1862 at the peak of the Civil War. President Lincoln established the National Academy of Sciences in 1863 at the peak of the Civil War. And so these are all examples. So the US has always focused on science and engineering and education during crisis, and we have a crisis now. This is the time to focus on this. And it's anybody's guess what's going to happen in the next year, but this is where we are. Sure.
Hi, my name is Shravi. I am currently a graduate student at the School of Engineering at GW, and I also did my undergrad here. And I kind of, pardon me, this might not be applicable to everyone here, but I have a different perspective on your presentation, which is as a woman or female student in engineering, and I work with the undergraduate department at the School of Engineering right now. We often see female students struggling to get through their engineering curriculum, or even like very hesitant about being able to, manage everything. I was just wondering what suggestions you have to offer us, and what I can, relay back to my undergraduate students regarding this issue. I know it's a little different from grants, but it's pretty big in our day-to-day, work that the undergraduate does, and even in the graduate department, the School of Engineering.
Yeah. So, it's a good point. In fact, if you look at the national numbers, some of which I showed, that sort of points to this trend. So one caveat I would add to that is, even if you take engineering, so I paid a lot of attention to individual engineering departments in my previous role as Dean of Engineering at MIT. If you look at within engineering, computer science and computer engineering is in a different place than material science and engineering, as in our chemical engineering. Chemical engineering, I think 2/3 of the undergraduate students are women students. Material science, it's about more than half. So it's very field specific. If you look at biology, it's very different from biomedical engineering. Biomedical engineering is another field which attracts a lot of women undergraduate students in many different universities. So it's very field specific, so we cannot average it. If you average it, there are a lot of variations to this. But having said that, I think there are different factors to this. I mean, engineering degrees, by and large, in any university are very demanding. Curricular demands are very large. It's not that other fields are not demanding, but the particular strict requirements, and this is something that universities have to pay a lot of attention to. There is even a bigger problem. It just goes beyond gender. 40% of all the freshmen who come to American universities with the intention of majoring in science and engineering end up majoring in science and engineering, 40%. They leave after the freshman year. It's a huge attrition after the freshman year. And this is a question that we need to ask. And in fact, this has been right and center in the discussion at so many forums, including AAU, et cetera. What are the things we can do? I think we need to, both national agencies and universities have to look at what are the factors that contribute to this, the demands placed versus the pressures on the students. If there are gender-specific pressures, how to address them. And there are field-specific issues because that's what the data shows. And why is one field doing so well when another field is not able to do well? I think these are role models, and do you have adequate faculty in that particular field who can be role models for the students who are in the department? So there are many complex factors, and it's very local. And I know of universities that have successfully addressed them. I know of universities that have issues with them. So we cannot broadly generalize them. But at the federal level, we are asking some of these questions. So we have a major program for undergraduate students called REU, Research Experience for Undergraduates. In funding requirements, one of the broader impacts criteria for proposals is to look at, there are many criteria, and one of the criteria is exactly this. So can we do something about this? There are national dialogues going on in the Committee on Science, and AAU has pilot projects that are on the horizon. So these are the kinds of things that we need to look at. But it's a very difficult question and a very important question. We are also looking at career-life balance initiative, which is a completely different angle. Hopefully that's aimed at postdocs and young faculty members, but definitely that can, the goal is to address that at the graduate student level and perhaps undergraduates.
Suresh, you've been very generous.